You are watching Lesson 1 for Fall 2020, The Dance of the Eye and the Hand for continuing students.
Welcome back. This is lesson number 1 for the fall of 2020. There will be 8 in this series throughout the fall. And these lessons are particularly developed for students who've had some basics in Chinese painting and wanting to go a little bit deeper. Today we're focused on using the brush and loading the brush and different ways to form its tip and load it. We'll be supplementing this activity with some simple exercises to try at home and then a model that hopefully incorporates all of the elements together. So let's get started.
Number 1, loading the brush.
So let's start with just simply loading the brush. If we're starting fresh, the first thing we need to remember to do is you always start with a wet brush. Take it to your water dish, get it fully wet, wick off the excess, maybe use your mixing dish to make your point. This is always where we start. So the hairs are wet. If it's too wet for what you're going to be doing, you can take a little bit of tissue and wick off some of that moisture, but you want to start with a wet brush so that the ink doesn't dry in the dry brush bristles and distort the shape of your brush. So we'll start with just loading the tip. So I'm just barely touching and working it just in the very tip of the brush. So this is one way to load a brush. This will give you a little more control, particularly for thinner lines. You could also load half the brush, go a little bit deeper, and then as I'm mixing it, work it higher into the brush. I'm showing you these 3 options because there's sometimes when a particular element that you're painting, you do not need to have the entire brush loaded with ink. So I've loaded up halfway up the hairs. Again, I can still do a thin line, but I can press and get a thicker line. There are then times, if you're doing larger characters or bigger strokes, where you want to load higher on the brush. Here I'm saying a full brush, but it's probably about, a little over 3/4 of the brush you want to get ink in. You don't want to get it all the way to the base. But here, turning as I go, mixing it higher, and again, let me work this to a point. I can still get a thinner line, a thicker line, and then with more pressing, a very thick line. So those are 3 basic ways of loading a brush. Just the tip, halfway, full brush.
Loading the foundation of the brush.
Next, we'll look at 3 different options for loading what I would call the foundation of the brush. The first will be just pure water, so I get my brush wet again. Work it to a point, and I'm just going to put, leave the water in and put just the tip to half mixed in ink. Now I can still make a black line with that, but if I use the side of the brush, we have water in the foundation and then black ink. If I use the side, I can get a nice gradation, black to light gray. I'm just going to, for simplicity sake, change brushes. You can just, if you're doing this at home, just wash your brush between those. Now we're going to start with a foundation of gray. So I've gotten my brush wet. I made up ahead of time a little bit of wash here. I'm going to put the wash in the entirety of the brush and then just put some black in the tip again, mix that in. And again, I can still get a black line with that, but if I use the side of this where I've loaded gray as a foundation, I'll get even more. Well, that didn't work very well. Let's try that again. And leave some of that moisture in. Even more of a gray than the first one. Thirdly, I will, I'm going to switch brushes again here so I don't have to wash it. Get my brush wet. Mix black in as my foundation. So I'm mixing it high in the brush. Again, I can still get a black line, but now if I use the side of the brush, I should get, let's get a little bit more in here. Get a pretty solid black as I go. Let's get a little more moisture. A little more. So I've gone from a foundation of water, a foundation of gray, foundation of black, and particularly the first two, to remember that if I'm doing gradations, the brush will continue to mix itself. So if I've had water mix black in and wait some time, it will start working its way up. So anything you put in as your foundation will get progressively darker. So if you're working with a mixed brush like this, you need to work quickly.
This model for loading the foundation of the brush is also available on the PDF with this lesson on the website. Number 3, loading the brush, the amount of moisture.
Now let's look at loading a brush to be either a dry brush or a wet brush. Again, we're starting with having gotten the brush wet. If I want to load a drier brush, once I've put my water in, I could take some of that water out and then load some ink, work it in. And then again, take some of that moisture out so that when I do my line, I can get a drier line. I could also do that with gray, load it with a gray, dry it off, and I can get a drier gray as well. Now, if I'm going to load wet, let's change brushes again. I've gotten my brush wet. I wick off some of the water, but I don't take any out. And here again, I'm going to load some black into a very wet brush. Here, when I press, or if I hold, so now I have a wet black brush. If I take a good measure of that out and press, I'm going to have more of a dry brush. Now, to give us an example of how that looks in practice, so I have my dry brush. I'm going to do a quick little tree here. Start with my first V, and even though these are thin lines, they're still fairly dry lines coming down. Another V. I'm not using calligraphy stamps, I'm using a little bit of a side of the brush. And then extend these branches up just a little bit. We'd also do some rocks, still with this dry brush, some outline, some shading lines. And I'm getting a nice broken line here, or flying white line here. So even though I have black in here, it is a dry brush. But if I wanted to do the opposite of that, I get a very wet brush that's really saturated with water. Pick up some ink, mix that in. Always test it to be sure what I have. Now I have a brush that is loaded wet and is perfect for making wet tree dots. Here all I'm doing, I'm not making a circle, I'm not really moving the brush. All I need to do is to press. And because I have such a wet brush, the brush does all the work. And if it gets slowing down, I can then just refresh it a bit, maybe a little bit of water, a little more ink, quick mix. And again, I'm just pressing. It's almost effortless. But as I press, that water spreads that ink. Doing dots like this, you want them to overlap. You want them to look a little messier than what your final result is, because once this dries, even though you can't individually distinguish the strokes or the dots while it's wet, once it's dry, you will see every impression. Now the ink is slowing down, it's not so much moisture, so I need to slow down as well if I want to maintain the density and the wetness that I started with. So one monitors the effect as you go, depending on what the condition of the water and the ink in the brush is. So we've had a dry loaded brush and a wet loaded brush. Let's give that a try.
This model for working with dry brush and wet brush is available in the PDF available with this lesson on the website. Number 4, loading the brush with multiple tones.
Now another way of loading the brush is to load it with multiple tones. I'm going to use a little bigger brush. You can do this with your landscape brush, but for sake of demonstration, it helps to have a bigger surface. I'm going to get this wet like we've done before and wick my water out. That's just a standard practice, is always to start with a wet brush. And I want to put multiple tones. I have a base of water in here. I'm going to take one brush and I'm just going to pick up some black and paint it right into the brush. Maybe one place there, another place over here. Then I'm going to take some gray wash, add a little bit of that in a couple of places. And if I use the side of the brush, I will get multiple tones. If I turn the brush as I go. So this is a much more random effect, but it's with one loading, you can move from almost pure water to gray to black. Again, remembering that the longer you take in before painting, this will all mix to a general gray. So what will start as water, gray, or black will spread in time, and the longer you wait, the more your result will be muddied. But so if you're going to load, work quickly. But this is great for various tones in black and gray. You could also use it in colors, mixing different colors on it and changing your tone or changing your intensity on the fly. And sometimes with some skill, remembering where you'd put various colors so that you can then have some control over it. But even with no control, it's great fun.
This model for working with multiple tones on a brush is in the PDF that accompanies this lesson. Number 5, using the brush, variations in shaping the hairs.
Now let's shift our focus from the loading of the brush to the use of the brush. And this section will be about the shape of the hairs. Again, I've gotten my brush fully wet, and I will use my mixing dish to comb the hairs, long horizontal strokes, getting those hairs all parallel. If I then load my brush, continuing to do the same, just straight pulling the length of the hairs to get those hairs parallel and to have the ink well mixed. So here I have a well-shaped point and will give me a nice strong line. Now another option is to flatten the hairs, and here I'll take the point of the brush and I'm just kind of squeezing it, turning it a little bit to get a flattened tip. So let's see if I get a little more of that. And with a flattened tip, it's more like a chisel, and I can get broader movements, or as I turn the brush, I can change its width as well. Lastly would be messy haired. Just pulling gently the hairs out in many directions. And this I can use for shading lines or other textures. Again, it's a more random way, but it's a way that I can get sort of feathering. Or very broken lines. So let's try loading your brush or using your brush in these 3 ways: combed haired, flattened hairs, and messy hairs.
This model for varying the shape of the brush is available in the PDF that accompanies this lesson. Number 6, using the brush in what position?
Now, continuing on with using the brush, we'll look at what position are you holding the brush, or what part of the hairs are you using. It can be with just the tip, the head, the full brush, the side of the brush, or the butt of the brush. So let me load this one. And I'm going to load this just with a heavy gray. So I'm going to start with using the head and making these rock outlines. I can use the tip to do some shading lines. I can use the side of the brush for a distant horizon line. If I change, I'm going to just change to a light gray and use the full brush, I can get distant hills using the full of the brush. And then finally, I can use the butt of the brush just to put in some rough, sort of intermediate lines. And then lastly, I can go back to my tip. I'm re-inking it with black, and I'll use the tip of the brush just for some distant trees. And these are just little pulled vertical dots in little groups, some bigger, some smaller. So I've used the tip of my brush, the head of my brush, the full brush, the side of the brush, and the butt of the brush. Let's give this a try.
This model for using the brush in various positions is available in the PDF that accompanies this lesson. Number 7, using the brush in different directions.
Now the last section of using the brush is about the direction in which we use the brush. Again, I've gotten my brush wet. I'm loading it with a good black ink, fairly full loading of the brush, wicking off any excess. So one motion is I start and I push away from myself. Another is pulling, coming towards myself. Another is to either push or pull, but do pressing as I go. This is a motion that most familiarly we use in a wave stroke. Moving, press, and lift. So we had pressing. We could also start with pressing and then lifting as we come. The last would be, and this is a little more expressive, is rolling your brush. And here I'm just taking the brush in the side of my hand, and instead of using the point, I'm using the side, but I'm rolling it as I go, and I can get much more texture and variation. Here I'm using the butt, side of the brush, maybe going back to tip to end with a line. So these are 5 directions: pushing, pulling, pressing, lifting, and rolling the brush. Why don't we try a page of playing with this?
The model for using the brush in various directions is available in the PDF that accompanies this lesson. Here's a model for you to practice that incorporates almost all of the ways that we have demonstrated in using the brush and loading the brush in this exercise. It is my interpretation of 17th century Chinese painter Shitao's Lakeside Geese, which includes a couplet from the 8th century Chinese poet Tu Fu. Wild geese from the lake fly in pairs when the veterans return from the old northern campaign. In this somber scene, the geese are returning from the northern country, which the southern Chinese remember historically as a land of bitter hardship and border warfare. The forbidding atmosphere supports the well-known anti-war sentiment of Tu Fu. The figure on the bridge is thought to be Shitao. From the 8th century to the 17th to the 21st, the prospect for war and hardship continues to be as inevitable as the return of the geese. The need for witness to peace remains as critical as well. This model is available also in the PDF that accompanies this lesson. Before you go, one last note. The handouts for the Dance of the Eye and the Hand for beginning students and continuing students, all lessons, are posted as downloadable PDFs at www.laughingwatersstudio.com. Have a good day. You have been watching Distance Learning from Laughing Waters Studio.